Welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Does this work? Can you hear me? There you go. That's the first time I've been applauded for one word, welcome. So we are so glad to have you here this evening. We are so looking forward to this time together with Taylor Branch. On behalf of the session and staff and the foundation of Church of the Palms, I welcome you to Church of the Palms for our Faith and Society Speaker Series. Our Faith and Society Speaker Series invites thought leaders from the broad spectrum of the Christian tradition as well as other spiritual traditions to address the issues of how people can engage the concerns of society, people of faith. Our speakers have included the late Michael Gerson, Brian McLaren, Father Gregory Boyle, Jamar Tisby, Jen Hatmaker, Cleo LaRue, Peter Weiner, and others. And we're very grateful to have the opportunity to hear from people such as those thoughtful, serious people about the challenging issues of our time and how the church is called to address them. And tonight is no exception, and as I said, you are in for a treat. But first, some housekeeping and some shameless promotion. First of all, most importantly, restrooms are available in the back, and if you want the women's room, you go that direction, and if you want the men's room, you go that direction. After Mr. Branch's presentation and a time of Q&A, which we will have following his address, conversation between the two of us, he will be available in the back of the sanctuary to greet you and to sign copies of his books. Perhaps some of you have brought copies of his books. If you haven't and you would like a copy of his more recent book on the civil rights movement, The King Years, we have a lot of copies available, so you are welcome to purchase one or many if you'd like and have him sign them. It's an excellent book. I heartily encourage you to pick up a copy. Among many things, Church of the Palms has sought to address the issue of race and racism, both in the church and in our community. Last year at this time, in concert with our sister congregation, Light of the World Church, we welcomed Dr. Jamar Tisby, who challenged us to live into what he coins as the arc of racial justice, ARC being the acronym for Awareness, Relationships, and Commitment. And we as a congregation have sought to pursue this journey in becoming more aware of systemic racism, building relationships in order to hear other people's stories, and committing ourselves to concrete steps toward confronting and diminishing racism in our community. Hopefully, as you came in, you received a copy of this information card. Did you all get one of these coming in? No, okay. Well, maybe we'll have some folks out there that could hand these out for us, or maybe, I don't know where those cards are, but we'll see that they get into your hands. They're scurrying even as we speak, so. But we'd love for you to have one of these because it, outlines for you some of the upcoming events that are being hosted not only by Church of the Palms, but our collaboration with other entities that include the following. We are encouraging you to join us for our historic Newtown Trolley Tour. Some of you perhaps have been on the Newtown Historic Trolley Tour that's led by Vicki Oldham and her wonderful organization. We have gone several times as a congregation and are planning another one on March the 3rd from 9:30 to 12. Cost is $45, and one of our folks will be here at the end if you would like to purchase a ticket to go on this trolley tour so that we can invite you to be a part of that. And it's a wonderful, wonderful education about Newtown and about the history of race in Sarasota. So we encourage you to join us for that. We also are sponsoring a discussion on Four Little Girls, the documentary, and to learn about the Birmingham church bombing in 1963, which killed 4 young girls. Many of you are aware of that event, and it's so wonderfully described in Taylor's book. but we would invite you to join us for a discussion on that documentary on March the 6th at 6 p.m. And then there are our early stages of planning a civil rights tour to Alabama, again in collaboration with Light of the World Church. Our two churches are coming together to begin planning that. And if you would like to learn more about that, you can check the Church of the Palms website or call the church office, and we'd be glad to give you information as that emerges over the course of the next, hopefully, couple of months. And then finally, the Suncoast Anti-Racism Initiative is another effort that has been collaborated upon by Church of the Palms and Light of the World as we seek to gather people together to create an interracial network in collaborating to confront and diminish racism on the Sun Coast. So this is information that we'd love for you to take home. And just as important, we would love for you, if you would like to get more information on ongoing efforts in terms of anti-racism, we would love for you to give us your name and your email and your phone number, and we will put you on a master list, and we'll make sure you know not only about things that are happening here at Church of the Palms, but also about what's happening with the Suncoast Anti-Racism Initiative. So we encourage you to tear that off and leave it in the back, and maybe we'll get some baskets back there for people to drop their little tear-offs so that we can send that information to you and put you on our mailing list until the end of time. No, I'm only kidding. Lastly, on the back side of this information card is information about the remaining two speakers in our Faith and Society speaker series, including Amy Jill Levine, Dr. Amy Jill Levine, who is a professor of New Testament and Jewish studies at Hartford Seminary. Dr. Levine is a wonderful, wonderful, winsome speaker who helps us to address issues between Jewish and Christian relations. Church of the Palms has a wonderful relationship with Temple Sinai, a neighboring Jewish congregation, and we are delighted to collaborate on this event where Dr. Levine will speak on Friday the 24th at Temple Sinai after their Shabbat service, and then Saturday the 25th here at Church of the Palms. So we invite you, the whole community is invited to join us for that. And then lastly, on March the 15th, Ross Douthat, celebrated columnist for the New York Times, will be here. Mr. Douthat is a wonderful writer on issues of politics and religion and his beloved Roman Catholic tradition. So we invite you to join us for those things as well. Thus endeth the shameless promotion. Getting on to the more important thing, before I introduce Mr. Branch, allow me to pray for us. Let us pray. We thank you, O God, for the opportunity we have here to be here this evening and to hear this wisdom and knowledge of this great man who has given his life over to writing the history of perhaps the most important movement in our nation's history, the civil rights movement. We are grateful for Taylor's dedication to this cause, and we are grateful that he's here with us this evening to share with us his perspectives on the movement as well as what it may teach us about our life together in this day. And so we pray your presence, and we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Taylor Branch is an American author and public speaker. Someone earlier today said that he should be considered a national treasure, and I believe that's the case, especially for his landmark narrative history of the civil rights era, America in the King years. The first of the trilogy, Parting the Waters, won the Pulitzer Prize and numerous other awards in 1989. Two successive volumes gained critical and popular success, Pillar of Fire and At Canaan's Edge. Some reviewers have compared the King-era trilogy, which required more than 24 years of intensive research, with epic histories such as Shelby Foote's The Civil War and Robert Caro's multi-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson. He returned to the civil rights history in his latest book, The King Years, which I just mentioned, and that will be available for sale tonight. In 2009 was published The Clinton Tapes, a memoir by Mr. Branch and his conversations, secret conversations with President Bill Clinton over the 8 years of his presidency. In 2011, the issue of The Atlantic published a wonderful article by Taylor Branch on the shame of college sports, which author and NPR commentator Frank DeFord said may be the most important article ever written about college sports. And I know I like college sports a little bit, so I enjoyed reading that article, and it was an eye-opener. He has presented seminars on civil rights in places such as Oxford University and sixth grade classrooms. His 2008 address at the National Cathedral marked the 40th anniversary of Dr. King's last Sunday sermon from that pulpit, and in 2009 he gave the Theodore H. White Lecture on the press and politics at Harvard. He is a musician. His musical sidelights have spanned the Atlanta Boys Choir in the 1950s, high school folk trio, a contemporary octet for spirituals, and perhaps the highlight, in 2006, he and his two friends reconstructed their 1960s college band as the cover group called Off Our Rocker, which has recorded and released 2 CDs in playful tribute to the Beatles. We are grateful to have you here, my friend, and thankful that we will get to hear your perspectives on the civil rights era and what we can learn from it. Would you please welcome Taylor Branch.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Pastor Steve. First of all, I want to thank the kind, strong man on the first row who opened my water so that my mouth works again. I couldn't do it, and he did. I really appreciate that. I'm glad to be here with you. It seems like I have a lot of friends. It seems like everybody makes their way to Sarasota at some point. I'm an Orioles fan because I live in Baltimore, so I like Ed Smith Stadium, so I've come down here. But I have some friends here going all the way back to the 60s. My dear friend Julian Bond's widow, Pam, is here. My friend David Hawk and his wife Joan Libby Hawk are here. I've met my first book was ghostwriting. When I broke into writing in the early 1970s, the way to become a writer was to be a ghostwriter. I was in magazines. My first ghostwritten book was with John Dean of Watergate. I lived with him in 1976, and his contemporary partner for his podcast is here in Sarasota. I saw him too. My next ghostwritten book was with Bill Russell of the Boston Celtics. I lived with him in 1977, and he just died last year, sadly. Shameless promotion. It's not really for me, but Netflix is airing a film biography of Bill Russell next month. It's not me. I didn't have anything to do with it except that I was interviewed, and it quotes my book a lot. So there are lots of people here that are familiar and congenial to me. I warned a few of them that I was going to try to tell stories tonight about the intersection of faith and citizenship in the public world that aren't meant to be just entertaining. Because I think the threat of cynicism and threats to democracy in our world are so serious that I hope maybe to talk a little bit about the review and what it's been like to study the movement, the freedom movement of the 1960s for most of my life, that raised some difficult ideas. We will never address these problems by coasting on comfortable ideas, which we have. So I want to talk about Dr. King's legacy, but also raise some challenging ideas that you may or may not want to discuss afterward. I'm happy to do that. I'm basically talking about the intersection of violence and nonviolence in an age threatened by cynicism. That's what I want to talk about, and I want to start with just a little bit of review or overview of the role of Martin Luther King. The main thing you need to know about Dr. King as a spokesperson for this freedom movement is his unique, sturdy balance in his oratory. No other speaker in the entire movement was so disciplined or so gifted in putting one foot in the scripture and another foot in the Constitution, so that he could talk about the intersection of church and state 5-6 times a day at a time when people were looking for ways to criticize him and reasons, including the New York Times and other people, not just George Wallace. They were looking to catch him, and the issues of church and state are among the most sensitive that we have. There is no record that I know of anyone ever accusing him of mixing church and state in a way that was improper or threatening. And the reason was that he was so gifted in basically saying, take it either way, equal souls or equal votes. They're both at the root of our tradition, our spiritual tradition, or our civic tradition. And his rhetoric, you can go look at it. One of its most distinctive factors is that in almost every sentence, he would say, we will win our freedom because the eternal will of God and the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage are embodied in our echoing demands. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and for the sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage. So it was a profound balance that he had. His favorite quote, which he used over and over again for justice, was from Amos 5:24. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. He used that in virtually every speech that he ever gave. And when he met Rabbi Abraham Heschel in 1963, who became one of his very, very close friends, a remarkable array of ecumenical friends from different faith traditions all over the world, Heschel talked to him about how that quotation and its image of justice was a corrective or a contrast to the Greek image of justice, which is on every courthouse that you see. It's a blind lady holding scales that are perfectly balanced. And that image of justice is static, conceptual, really almost mathematical. Things are supposed to be in balance and everybody gets their portion of justice. And what they agreed, and the question was, why is Dr. King so drawn to let justice roll down like waters, which is motion and emotion and movement, as opposed to the scales of justice, which are in static, perfect mathematical balance and not moving at all? And he said, essentially, because it is personal, and that justice for him as a black pastor and somebody steeped in the American tradition was more drawn to the Hebrew conception of justice. Roll down like waters, when something moves and changes and restores and lifts and refreshes us, and that it is human and very personal. He elaborated that, and I'm not a Bible scholar, but his favorite Bible story, which he quoted more than any other, some people say that he quoted the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan, and recited that in his oratory a lot. And maybe he did more than this one, but I don't think so. He told, and it's rarely told, I don't know how often Pastor McConnell talks about it, but he told hundreds of times he would reprise the story of Lazarus and Dives from Luke 16, verses 19 through 31. And a quick reprise of that story, which he loved to preach on, I can give you. It's unique in the Bible. It's all in the mouth of Jesus. It's all a quotation from him, telling a story that bounces back and forth between heaven and hell, which is almost unheard of in the Bible. Him talking about what's going on in heaven and hell. He talks about the poor beggar Lazarus who begged outside the mansion of a rich man named Dives, who didn't pay any attention to him. And they both died, and Lazarus went to heaven, And Dives, the rich man, went to hell and looked up and saw Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham and proceeded to have a conversation. So here's Jesus talking about a conversation between heaven and hell. And Dives, the rich man, says, I see Lazarus is up there. Father Abraham, send Lazarus down here to give me some water because I'm burning here and it's awful. And Abraham said, I'm sorry, you had good things in your portion in life, and now he's here and you're there, and that's pretty much the way it is. And Dives then says, well, if you can't send water down to me, send Lazarus to give my brothers a warning, because I have 5 brothers, and I don't want them to wind up here. And Dr. King would always say, this is a very interesting point in the story, because here's this guy down in hell who's suffering, and first of all, he's arguing with Abraham, and the Bible likes people who argue with God or argue with Abraham, and here he is arguing with this, and his first thought is if he can't be helped himself, he wants to help his brothers. Dr. King would say, Dives was a liberal. He was thinking of others. He wanted to help his brothers. And Abraham said, no, they won't listen. It's no good. They're not going to do that. And then Dives continues the argument, and he said, well, they may not listen. They have the prophets, and they have the Bible, and they're not paying any attention to that. But if somebody comes back from the dead and warns them, then maybe they'll listen to that. And Jesus, it's a pretty remarkable moment in the Bible, not long before he's crucified and risen himself, says to Dives down there, well, if they're not going to pay any attention to the prophets, they won't pay any attention even if somebody comes back from the dead and tells them that. Dr. King loved to talk about this story because he says, you know, it's not wealth that divides whether you're in heaven or hell. It's not a lot of things. You can argue about it. But you have to understand, Dives is a rich man, but he's in hell talking to Abraham, who's one of the richest people in all of antiquity. So wealth didn't keep him out of heaven. He's up there. It's not wealth. It's not a lot of the decisions. It's not his attitude, because he wanted to help his own brothers. Dr. King said that his reading of this was that Dives' main sin was that he never saw Lazarus as a person. That even when he has seen the revelation that his life has condemned him for eternity, and that Lazarus the beggar is up there with Abraham, he never speaks to him. He never says anything to him. He says, send Lazarus, as though he's still a servant. Send Lazarus to my brothers. Send Lazarus down to me. Dr. King said, the central failure here is the failure to understand personhood across the gaps that divide us. And that Abraham was telling him those gaps will be permanent, the great divide that divides us, because we don't see each other as people. And that was the moral to the story that he had, that Dives did spiritual violence to Lazarus by not recognizing his humanity. Now, the personal side of this story, this may be an odd segue, but when I was growing up in Atlanta and a small boy, the first thing that awakened me to the personal nature of the difficulties of getting over these great gulfs between the races. This is Atlanta in the 1950s. Totally segregated. Although my school said we weren't segregated, it's just that my high school, that the right African-American student had not applied yet. But we didn't have any white students. And of course, you can imagine the sarcasm that we greeted that pretext with. But there we were in Atlanta, and the first thing that made me start thinking about the divide across the races was to realize that when I drove to school, I was listening almost exclusively to black music on the radio. In the crossover era of Ray Charles and Jackie Wilson and Sam Cooke. And I and my friends wouldn't dream of courting our girlfriends to anybody else. About the whitest person that we really liked and associated with romance was Johnny Mathis. How is it that white students who are growing up in a totally separate world, taught to wear neckties and use big words, feel that Ray Charles has the keys to the heart when it comes to matters of romance? Extremely personal. And crossover rock and roll music in the 1950s into the 1960s, you could hear, but you could not see, nor be with, but the music itself spoke the language of emotion. And the language of emotion is what converts us. It was the first lesson, indication that I had what I later formed as a rule, that abstractions and concepts do not make discoveries where there are human barriers that need to be broken. It's something that breaks down those barriers and shakes you up a little bit and is a personal encounter or personal experience. And in a weird way, listening to Sam Cooke saying a change is going to come would do that. And it happened all through this period. And it was at the same time I was noticing that Atlanta, my hometown, adopted its civic motto to ward off criticism of segregation in the early 1960s. It's still the civic motto, 60-something years later. Atlanta is the city too busy to hate. And my friends and I would discuss, we went to school the next day to discuss with our English teacher, how can this be our civic motto? Isn't it plain from our own motto that we're saying if we don't stay busy, our natural inclination is to hate, so we have to ward it off by staying busy so we won't notice it. It's a deep personal confession about the greatest abstract issue that we were dealing with at that time, segregation. So it introduced me to the great conundrum of violence of the spirit and the difference between violence and nonviolence, because Dr. King was preaching nonviolence in that era. And I want to talk, that's what the main thing I want to talk about, our understanding of violence and nonviolence in this world, and our understanding of how the two relate to each other in this world. We have thousands of words for various forms of violence. If you go through the alphabet, almost every letter has 10 or 12 words. You know, bombardier, bomb, blast, blitzkrieg. There are all kinds of words for violence. There are very few words for nonviolence. In Dr. King's era, it was totally separated and put off in an odd world, that nonviolence was something for black people. Dr. King used to get upset about it because he thought it was only for Gandhians. And when he went to India, he came back and said, you know, the Gandhians over there are weird. They're fasting all the time. They don't want to step on insects. And I'm afraid that anybody in America who hears about nonviolence will think that it's only for oddballs, that nonviolence is something peculiar. And as I'll tell you a little later, the first insight he had was we have one word for nonviolence that is competing with thousands of words for violence, and our word for nonviolence is vote. A vote is nothing but a piece of nonviolence that's been established between civilized people wrestling personally with their relationships with one another for how they can manage society without violence. Now, the idea that votes are as powerful as violence and armies is still absurd to most people in the world. I mean, close your eyes and imagine yourself in Navalny's cell in Russia. How can you go about converting Russia from its current autocracy and system that is based on violence to one that respects votes? How could you do that if you were one of the women in Iranian prisons for not wearing their headscarf properly? Or in Burma, Myanmar, now where the army is taken over. For many of the countries around, let alone North Korea, you can hardly even think in North Korea. The currency of politics in the world is violence in most places. Every king who was ever established was established as the result of war. That's what it was. And the guarantee of legitimacy was the king's army. This is particularly important when you think about it and apply it to the history of race relations in the United States, because for the first 250 years, the relations between black and white in the United States were based exclusively on violence. The laws of the southern states, I have the 1839 law book for the state of Georgia, and almost half of it is laws governing slaves and black people, how mortgages would work, how often the banker could inspect the teeth and the body of a mortgaged slave to make sure that the mortgage lendee was not destroying or mishandling the collateral. It was all based on violence. And it's hard to get around that, and to some degree, and the United States wiped out the memory of the broad application of violence in race relations in slavery, such that today we have no idea, and there are no history courses that teach what was national security in the South when it was peopled out in the countryside with slaves who were governed only by violence, had no consent, and they were out in the countryside with white women and children in isolated farms. And we have instances of slave revolts, but very few. And it's because the Pentagon of that era and the national security system of that era was pervasive slave patrols that every man was drafted into. They originated the word beat in the beat that they had to patrol, and there were incredibly detailed rules about what they could do to prevent weapons, escapes, and anything else, what their duty was, and what license they were mandated to do to punish slaves who had reading materials or weapons, but not go so far that they were damaging the property of their fellow slaveholders. That is a balance that was minutely adjusted in state legislatures all through the 19th century and quickly forgotten. We don't remember slave patrols. We don't know what they were. In Virginia, you had to read the basic laws of slave patrols from every Anglican church's pulpit twice a year to remind people what those rules were, because that's how much was at stake. Otherwise, it would be like almost the equivalent today, when we have 30 million black people in the United States, of having 30 million ISIS fighters scattered in the United States. What kind of security system would we have? Well, that's what they had then, and they quickly forgot it. And they even more forgot the fact that the Second Amendment was put in the Constitution to protect those slave patrols, not to protect the right of some yokel to take an AK-47 into Starbucks. That's what it was for. So we forget this kind of memory. Violence and nonviolence are a radioactive, but also a positive part of American history. Our democratic experiment is an experiment in nonviolence. That's what it is. There have been people trying to govern themselves by nonviolence before the American Constitution, before the American Revolution. Most notably, I know that some of you here are from Pennsylvania. The Quakers governed Pennsylvania from 1682 until 1756. That's a long time, with no militia and no constables and they never bought a single musket. So at a time when you think of violence as primitive, more primitive than the Wild West, more primitive than anything else, Pennsylvania had a nonviolent government in public at a time when they believed that nonviolence was the essence of the Christian faith, it was the light within, and that it should govern society. It's a tragic history how that discipline was subverted, in part, of course, by the in-migration of lots of other groups that made the Quakers a minority, but also by the infighting of the European powers who were trying to provoke Indian fights to make the Quakers be isolated and make the fellow Pennsylvanians resent the fact that they weren't being defended with violence. But the really interesting thing is that 80-year period. It happened then. And then after the Revolution, one of the most interesting things to me in studying this history is that Jefferson had gone to France. And James Madison sent him an enormous log of books that he wanted from European bookstores and libraries on one question: why did every ancient republic fail? They were all overthrown by violence. Many of them from ancient Greece, but they were the Acacian League, and there were lots of them, but not for 2,000 years. They were overthrown by violence, and of course, in their time, the King of England and all the other kings governed by violence. Madison wanted to try to figure out how to design a republic that could run on votes and withstand the pressures of temptations and the incitements to violence that inevitably would follow. And he spent 4 years doing it, and he took to Philadelphia a plan to do that. Now, the plan was modified. That's another story for another lecture and how it happened. But the fact of the matter is that the Constitution is designed to have America be a cathedral of votes, i.e. nonviolence. The Supreme Court rules by votes. Every branch of government, and the mechanics of it are designed to make it resist subversion and make it resist incitements to violence. That's what it's about. Now, in the 1830s, there arose a very instructive debate between William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass over the American Constitution. Garrison said, the Constitution is a pact with slaveholders. It is rife with concessions for slaveholders, the 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave clause, a whole bunch of other things. Therefore, he burned the Constitution in public events and said we should get rid of the Constitution, form a new union, and let the South go and keep slavery. And Douglass preached that himself for a number of years, and then came to a radical turn the other way and said, if you study that Constitution, it holds the promise for equality on the far side of slavery, and even under the proper circumstances, ways to eliminate slavery. That's why the slaveholding states were so paranoid that they were going to be outnumbered by free states. They were worried about the processes of the Constitution. That's what led to the Civil War. So there developed a fratricidal war between people who had risked their lives in the abolition cause. And Douglass revolted against Garrison and said, we want to uphold the Constitution to use it. Yes, it's a pact with slaveholders. Yes, there's compromise in there. But you have to respect the fact that those slaveholders were trying for the first time in history to stop warring among themselves, which is what they'd been doing. Protestants and Catholics and different nationalities had been slaughtering each other across Europe. That's why they came here. And they tried to form a constitution so that at least they could have nonviolence and votes govern the relationships among themselves. Therefore, this is good. Sad to say, Garrison accused Douglass of disloyalty and said that he had a white mistress and brought out racism against him, and it was an ugly controversy. But Douglass stayed true to that belief through the Civil War, and all afterward, when all of the promise of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were squandered, and the 15th Amendment was essentially anesthetized. We forgot that it was in the Constitution for a century until the movement came along later. But Garrison still held on to it to the very end of his life, saying this is an experiment worth doing if we take for real the principles that we've put there. He said there is no Negro problem in America. The problem is whether white Americans believe what they've written in this paper, and if they will treat the former slaves at least as well as they treat the people who fought against the United States in the Civil War. And he believed that all along to the end of his life. So the two of them introduced this really pregnant question. What is our Constitution? It is novel in the world. It is the first experiment. We are the oldest democracy since the ancient days. We do govern things by votes. It is imperfect. Madison said at the convention, by the way, that the worst compromise of Republican principles that he had introduced was not the compromises with slavery, because he said, we believe slavery will end. He said the worst compromise was the Senate that gave each state an equal vote in the Senate as a sop to the small states in the North, Connecticut and Delaware, and they made a deal with the hungry slave states of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia to impose those mutual compromises of Republican principles. And he said that the malapportioned Senate will only get worse. And of course today we have two senators representing Wyoming's 500,000 people and two senators representing California's 40 million. There's nobody that I know of has thought of a way of correcting that. It's very, very difficult. But nevertheless, it's still a blueprint and something that we work with, and seldom think of the fact that it is a cathedral of votes and that the whole thing is a nonviolent experiment, except when January 6th rolls around and people say, well, if people can stop an election with violence, then that means democracy's not working. Well, yeah, that's right. That means they're substituting violence, and they haven't even thought about the fact that even if they won and imposed a new government by violence, what would they do when a feud broke out among them and violence was reestablished as the only medium for politics, and a feud broke out in their militia group at the checkpoint and the country was falling apart? How do they reestablish the commitment and the belief to nonviolence that has animated our Constitution as imperfectly as it has for all of this time? It was remarkable in 1965 how the nonviolent movement that raised up between the bus boycott in 1955 and the Selma movement in 1965 and set in motion things that are still producing equal citizenship, not just for black people in lots of places, would make a room like this, where we have a mixed crowd of blacks and whites in a room. When I was growing up, a room like this would make everybody scared because you were challenging the established order. You were threatening the stability of businesses of everybody that was in here if you were known to be in a mixed group. We take every breath liberated beyond the degree that we know that equal citizenship has allowed women, gay people, immigrants, a measure of freedom and acceptance in our society that we never had. The year after Dr. King was killed, you mentioned college sports, Pastor. The University of Texas won the national championship in football with a team that had 93 players on the roster, not a single black person. This is after Dr. King is killed. Now today, there are a lot of racially hostile white people, but they all want black players on their team at the University of Texas. And if you tried to get rid of them, you would have trouble on your hands. We take for granted the things that we breathe in that are steps forward in this. But what we don't really understand, and I want to try to close with, is understanding the reaction against the liberations that were set in motion by the nonviolent movement. Dr. King was extremely conscious of the fact that the discipline of the nonviolent movement went straight to validate and rested upon the explanations for the early founders for what would make our constitutional experiment work. Madison wrote, every votary of freedom rests all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government, that you can govern yourself individually and that you can govern yourselves collectively, which was a far-fetched and dubious idea, to say the least. And he also said that without virtue in the people, the whole idea of self-government is a ridiculous notion. You've got to be building self-governing public trust in order to make people develop an institutional reliance on votes instead of violence and armies. King, they studied that a lot. There's nobody that has a deeper commitment and a more contagious commitment to self-governing public trust than a freedom rider who, just for sitting next to somebody of a different race on a bus, can say to a Klansman who gets on the bus with a club and is about to beat them, we may not reach you by the witness and our discipline here to be self-governing and believe that you can change, but your children and our children will form bonds on the basis of what we're doing here. That's self-governing public trust. That is a racial movement that is considered in the language of esoteric Gandhian nonviolence, but it's really at the heart of the American experiment. It's at the heart of what our Constitution is about. And the change in 1965 was so sharp to introduce the backlash that we're still introducing it. I had to bring my glasses up here because I think I'll get the quote wrong. These are two quotes from Dr. King in the same year, in 1965. One is right after Selma, and one is 4 months later, right after the Watts riots in September of 1965. Here's the first one. The stirring lesson of this age is that mass, nonviolent, direct action is not a peculiar device for Negro agitation. Rather, it is a historically validated method for defending freedom and democracy and for enlarging these values for the benefit of the whole society. He said that commitment to nonviolence is what makes democracy creative and self-fulfilling, self-perpetuating. That, by the way, is a quote from a speech he gave to the Synagogue Council of America in New York at the Americana Hotel in May of 1965. Now, just a few months later, after Watts, he said, 100 political commentators have interred nonviolence into a premature grave. And nonviolence, which was the most powerful idea that set these things in motion to benefit not just black people, but virtually the whole society, including the white South, which was known as the hookworm belt when it was segregated, was not fit for professional sports, and turned into the Sun Belt when it was no longer segregated, and its officials became eligible and not stigmatized for national office. And in fact, 7 of the next 8 presidents came from the Sun Belt. Carter and them, there were no Southerners eligible to that. The Civil Rights Movement liberated the white South psychologically and economically. I interviewed the mayor of Atlanta in the summer of '64, because I went to school with his son, Ivan Allen, and he said that he went to the city council in Atlanta in July of '64, as soon as the Civil Rights Bill was passed, and got a resolution passed to build a stadium in Atlanta, downtown, on land that they didn't own with money they didn't have for a major league team that they hadn't located. But within 18 months, they lured the Milwaukee Braves to become the Atlanta Braves, the first professional sports team in the South when it was no longer segregated. And then came the Miami Dolphins and the Atlanta Falcons and all of that. These benefits have blessed us all. They've blessed the parents of every daughter who wants to go to a major college that couldn't go until the civil rights movement raised all these questions of what is equal citizenship. And lo and behold, women could go. I was at Princeton when the first undergraduates came to Princeton. I was a grad student there. I saw how they were treated. They were treated as badly as the first black students in Little Rock almost by the Princeton undergrads. And lo and behold, a few years later, they're going to West Point. Nobody thought girls at West Point? And now we take all that for granted. These things were set in motion. But Dr. King recognized that in that one year, 1965, nonviolence, the backlash went against it. The next speech that never gets any credit, he gave a little speech in which he said that he had noticed that George Wallace had, when he ran for president, had revised his stump speech to eliminate all racial references, except that he said he had never made a speech in his entire life that reflected badly on any person because of his race, that his only concern and his abiding concern was to restore local government from the usurpations of pointy-headed bureaucrats, liberal judges, and tax and spend legislators. And he invented the whole vocabulary of resentment of government itself. And he transmuted the hostility that previously had been legitimate to express in public by public officials against black people. And to cuss them for what they were doing, he turned it into a hostility of the government itself, such that people learned to pronounce Washington like a cuss word, Washington, and they're trying to tell us what to do. And that over time curdled into a resentment that morphed into cynicism, literally, about the government. Who needs the government? We've got our guns. That reaction against the promise of nonviolence informs our politics unconsciously today. And we don't have people appreciating the value of nonviolence and the value of what we have, and the fact that what we have in our constitutional order is a form of nonviolence. There's no other way to define it. Now, I want to close on some two quick, difficult issues. We, on the pro-nonviolence, on the civil rights side, on the pro-brotherhood side, I think contribute by not thinking. Madison said that the politics of trying to establish the vote are the most profound meditation on human nature. What human nature can do, what's it capable of. Can you really make people trust votes when instinctively they want a king? They're like the British tabloids. They've got to have the king. They've got to talk about the king all the time. It's catnip. They can't do it. And he said it's a profound meditation to try to figure out how. We need to be thinking about that too. In that sense, I want to say, I think that we need to rethink two common things that you always hear among people in favor of racial reconciliation. One, people say we need racial healing. We need racial healing, and I understand that. I hear people say it all the time. But if a moment's thought, if you think about it, to heal something is to restore a previous condition of health. There has never been a previous condition of health in race relations in the United States. It understates the whole value of what we have achieved in coming from a monarchy, a slave-holding monarchy, whose very members dreamed of a society that could get above it. We have moved along a spectrum that is more healed or more healthy, but still a long way to go as far as the great divisions that divide us, many of which are still enforced by latent violence in our public affairs. That's what all the controversy about police is. To some degree, our relations between the races are still governed by violence. They determine where people live. They determine often, how easy it is for people to have the kind of ordinary exchange that creates the wholesomeness and the trust in votes and our system that we all seek. So we're not trying to heal and restore something that previously existed. Everything that we have done in the way of improved relations is like the American Constitution. It's something that is new in human nature. For all of its flaws, it is a step forward. And perhaps even more difficult, I would like to stimulate conversations among yourselves, and I know it's popular, and in fact it's actually on the little flyer you gave me, conversations about working for anti-racism. What does anti-racism mean? What constructive, if you understand that American race relations and American nonviolence in the political sphere is creating something positive that benefits all mankind that never existed before, how does the notion of a successful war of anti-racism advance that? Because really, if anti-racism is about stomping out something, and it has absolutely no image of what would be left on the bare ground once it's stamped flat. Anti-racism is not good enough to me. I know it is fashionable. I know Ibram Kendi. I've been with him. I've had talks about him. But anti-racism is too facile. And people on our side of this debate need to be thinking as well, because we need to recognize the fact that the leaders of the African American movement, and I'm speaking of Frederick Douglass, Ida Wells, Martin Luther King, Bob Moses, Julian Bond, all the leaders of SNCC, in my view, stepped into the role of the original founders in trying to create something that had never existed, a multiracial functioning democracy based on votes and nonviolence. And they took a system that was hierarchical with only white men on the TV and no black folks, and set in motion changes that would make it more equal. To my view, they are modern founders. They're just like Madison. They're doing that. And that is a constructive purpose that needs every help that it can get. And we need to recognize that it's by building new things, new relationships across the lines that divide us, that we're building something new and positive. We're not trying to stamp out everybody who comes up and says, I'm a racist, because nobody will do that. And all you've got is accusations that compete with other accusations. It understates how positive the nonviolent movement is, both in religion, from the Quakers down through Dr. King's sermons, and how positive it is in the course of human history, from an unbroken trail of wars to the prospect of democratic governance that actually works for everyone. So I honor the modern founders. We need more of them. We need to celebrate that by doing what they did, taking chances across the lines that divide us, doing things that are personal. I told people today that Diane Nash told me, she's a major hero of mine, that every day in the movement felt like her wedding day, in the sense that her knees were shaking when she's trying to decide whether to go on a demonstration where she might be arrested or beaten or stuff like that, just the way her knees were shaking when she got married. And what they had in common is she knew she was doing something that would define her life, and was taking a leap based on people that she didn't really know how it was going to work out with her husband. And the movement was when that worked well, and it grew. And that's what we need, and it's tremendously positive. So in conclusion, I would say as a white Southerner who grew up in the segregated South, wondering what made these kids march into dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham? Where did it come from? I have to give thanks that there was a movement that had the discipline, the wisdom, and the political genius to lift nonviolently the rest of us toward the meaning of our own professed values. And that's what we need to recognize about the civil rights movement, is the positive side of it, the positive side of our freedom that's under threat today, and that nonviolence is not some weird thing. It's the heart of our society. It's the heart of our faith. It's the heart of our faith in a congregation like this, and it's the heart of our civic faith as citizens. Thank you.
Get to be a furniture mover when you're a pastor, so. Thank you, Taylor, for
Thank you, Steve.
A very challenging and stimulating presentation. You've given us a lot to think about, so thank you for that. I want to ask you about cynicism, and as you reflect upon whatever cynicism that was at work in the movement, the era of Martin Luther King, and the cynicism you observe today, do you sense there are any differences between the nature of that cynicism?
Well, I don't know how I'd really describe the cynicism of Dr. King's age. There was definitely PTSD, and people have been going to jail for years. It was like a war, and a lot of people got tired of it. And I think there was impatience, and there was, I talked to Stokely Carmichael about this a good bit. What made him snap in Mississippi? He'd been going to jail for 6 years. I don't think that it was a cynicism. I think that was just a frustration, and people reverted to what all of history told them, which is that if it's a contest between the ballot and the bullet, and the ballot didn't work, grab your gun. Now, that didn't really work very well. All of those groups faded out pretty quickly, and they never offered a vision as to how they were going to reconcile or even run a separate community based on the bullets instead of the ballots. So it didn't last very well. But I don't think it had the same. What we're dealing with now in modern cynicism is the result of a political formula, and I said George Wallace invented it. I really believe that. He invented this language where you appeal for votes on the basis of resenting the government that is mandating that you treat people better, that you observe and obey the Civil Rights Bill. And it lasted over time. Ronald Reagan said the 9 scariest words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." It was cultivated. You ran for office and you won by saying you were for states' rights and that the federal government was one size fits all and that they couldn't run a 2-car funeral and that they didn't know what they were doing, and you cultivated kind of a doubt about that until over time it became almost blindly, if you listen to the rhetoric of people, all they do is say they want to tear down the government, cut your taxes, cut everything except the military, which of course is not the democratic part of our government. The military is Genghis Khan had a military. Everybody venerates the military. That's not part of democracy. So what we have is, I think, the modern cynicism that we're fighting in our people who justify wanting to overthrow the election. And there's still millions of people who do that. It's the product of a long cultivation of doubt. Nobody ever celebrated the Second Amendment until about 30 or 40 years ago. But now they've literally told people, don't rely on the U.S. Constitution, rely on your guns. You don't need the American Revolution. You don't need the American Constitution. That's something they do in Washington, all those terrible politicians up there. So it's been cultivated to the point, and now I define cynicism. I don't think cynicism is a judgment where you present a body of evidence on this side about how the government is working, and this side a body of evidence about how it's not working, and you say, I think it's not working. I think cynicism is an appetite. It's a desire to see that, and it's cultivated. It's an attitude that is cultivated, and therefore it's really hard to change. And that's what makes it dangerous. So I don't really know of. I mean, a lot of people think that Malcolm X was cynical back in the early '60s, and I spent a lot of time working on Malcolm X with people around him, and he was the last thing he was a cynic. He was a realist, and he was an idealist in ways that haven't been appreciated to this day. So I don't really know of people in the '60s that I would say are. The condition that we're dealing with now is a cultivated cynicism over a period of 50 years. And it's deeply rooted, and it's unconscious. I think there are a lot of people who are cynical about the government who don't realize that it really originated in and expressed a reaction to the civil rights movement. People have no idea that race is hands down the most potent electoral force that's ever been in national politics. I mean, how many people realize that the South had been 100% Democratic for a century until Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill in '64, and Barry Goldwater from the party of Lincoln said he was voting against the Civil Rights Bill, and all of a sudden the first Republicans in the history sprang up in the South. And very soon, the partisan structure of the United States turned upside down. I mean, when I was little, we didn't have any Republicans in Atlanta. They were, except for a few eccentric judges, Republicans were Yankees. And the history of the Republican Party, I mean, they were the ones who did the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in a span of 4 years. Unbelievable. Yes, there was some politics and cynicism and control to it, but they risked their fortunes for it, and they believed in it, and it was all just to get suffrage, to allow black people, the former slaves, to be able to vote. And for that, every kid in America knows that scalawags and carpetbaggers are evil people, and that they were opportunists, even though they were risking their lives and soon crushed for supporting voting rights in the South. So it's infiltrated our very language. So, and I think the same thing that happened after the Civil War happened after the Civil Rights Movement a century later, a movement, a backlash. People talked about the backlash, but I don't think they recognized that it was going to last for a long time and that it was going to cultivate cynicism. You could get elected to the national government by denigrating the national government, and you didn't have to have a positive program. And over time, I think that's really caused a lot of harm. Now, some people it's all right with me. I mean, I'm not, I think the greatest need the country has is more responsible Republicans. I'm not a partisan Democrat, but I am saying that this temptation allowed one party to become the party of resentment of the federal government, and that it's had effects that we're still dealing with. Sorry, that may be too much about.
Don't apologize. What's your thought about how social media plays into not only our present climate, but also as a tool potentially in terms of racial justice and racial reconciliation and advancing the movement, as it were? I mean, you're a Twitter guy. You tweet away.
I tweet less now. I feel so bad. I drive a Tesla, and I loved Elon Musk until he started going off the rails. I don't really know what to say about Twitter anymore. It is kind of I lament the fact that our news media have succumbed so much, that so many newspapers are gone, that the news is not really news anymore. It's just kind of an endless editorial. And I worry that people, I think we talked about this today, we are all much more influenced by the news media than we want to think. We don't know what people in politics are saying and doing every day. The only way we know about it is whatever is reported. So the very things we say that candidate X, Y, or Z ought to be doing, they may be doing, but you won't know it unless it gets reported. And I think that the established news media, the decline of newspapers, the decline of advertising, these are all profoundly threatening, and I don't really know that much about social media that they can take that place of something that would, a place where people could go and have a check on their inclinations to say, let me consider the other side. That's a role that social media is not well equipped to provide. Social media is about mobilizing people who already feel the same way. It's not about debate or discovery or any of those things. So I'm not as optimistic as I would like to be about the potential for social media, but then again, I don't know that much about them, and they're constantly changing. You know, we have to remember that only a century ago, most people lived on farms, and we've been dealing with the throwing together and how immigrants and races and everything are going to be dealing, but at the same time, everybody's been getting displaced. Displaced from the countryside to the cities. You know, when we were growing up, there were 2 million telephone operators. You know, they all got displaced. Everybody's getting displaced. And I have at least 50 friends who should be still working on newspapers, and the newspapers have dried up. So our society is dealing with displacement as an economic issue, and the government ought to be a place where we debate how we handle that and how we adjust to it. That's what we did in the Great Depression. That's what we did, you know, that's what it's for. But if you have atrophied the very confidence that the government is a place that can provide positive solutions for that, you're not going to be able to do it. And, you know, here we have climate change and all these other things that really cry out desperately for collective debate and responsible action. And we live in a time when a lot of people are still poisoned by the cynicism against the government. I'm sorry, that's not a good answer. I don't know.
No.
I don't know about social media, what they can do. The only thing you know is that it's always up to the citizens. You know, the first 3 words in the Constitution are "We the people." And if you read it, one of my solutions, by the way, which I've proposed on Twitter and it's never gotten anywhere, I think every political debate should start with every candidate on the podium reciting the preamble of the Constitution. It's 1 sentence, it's very short, but it is breathtakingly optimistic about the responsibility that's vested in we the people. You know, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's it. But when you think about that, there are a lot of politicians that I think would have a hard time making those words come out of their mouth.
A lot of us here, lots of opinions about critical race theory. Mm-hmm. I know you've never been asked this question before. You're a historian, and I'm sure you have some views about, you know, the debate about all that and with what you see in our country in terms of movements against retelling the history of our land. So, thoughts about that?
There's no such thing as critical race theory. Because a theory is a proposition that can be tested and that whose boundaries and limits and applications are clear from the meaning of the words. So it's a settled theory. To explain something as complicated as race in the United States, there's no such thing as critical race theory. It's what race is. It's a conceit to say that to accuse one side of having a settled answer to race in a critical theory that everybody knows nobody really has, that will short circuit any discussion of what race really is, which is a give and take, which is part of, race is a part of everything. It's not all of anything, but it's a part of everything. And what we're really seeking is comfort to discuss the place of race in everything. And the people who criticize critical race theory are saying two things. The other side has a finished theory of race, which we know is not true, and we want to get rid of that instead of opening our own discussion of the place of race, because we're not comfortable doing that. We're comfortable accusing them of pretending to have a finished theory. So this is not new. It's more or less the same as woke. Now, in ordinary parlance, you would say in discussing anything serious like race relation that it's better to be awake than asleep. And yet woke is a piece of sarcasm, right? Because it's saying, it's like critical race theory. It's saying we all know that it's like George Wallace, who always used to say, look at liberals, they pretend that they know what they're doing on race, but they don't really know what they're doing, and they overpromise what they're doing, and they think they've got it solved, and they think it's all great. But I, George Wallace, want to tell you, look in Washington, D.C., they just had to build a Theodore Roosevelt bridge over the Potomac River to accommodate all the liberals trying to get out of Washington. Liberals are phony. This is the same, and it's like politically correct. It's a piece of slang that all you have to do is to say somebody is politically correct. It's sarcasm about them. It implies that they have a finished virtue that they don't have, and that all you have to do is toss sarcasm at them, and then you don't have to say anything. You don't have to wade into the discussion. You don't have to test a proposition. You don't have to say, this is what my relationships across the racial boundaries have been. You want to say, really what it does is it advertises people's discomfort with race. And that's true on both sides of the aisle. People want to be finished with race, but that's the telltale sign that they really need more engagement. Because if they're not comfortable enough to talk about where they're comfortable and not, and talk about what they've learned and what they'd like to learn, then it means that's exactly what they ought to do. But instead, people always want the race discussion to be over. Accusing somebody of being a supporter of critical race theory or of being politically correct ends every conversation. It aborts it. It cuts it off. And that's what it's designed to do, because people don't want to have an open conversation about it. And, that's one of the real problems that we have, that we want to get rid of race instead of treating it as a natural part of the landscape that we're all becoming more and more familiar with in our everyday lives. To me, it's like saying, it's so misguided. It's like saying that the goal of democracy would be to stop having any more elections. Because we'd finished elections, we don't need to have any more elections. That's like critical race theory. The fact of the matter is we always have elections. That's the lifeblood of it. That's how we change. That's how we grow. And similarly, that's how we grow in relations across not only race, but all the other boundaries that divide us. And so I see it just as a symptom of how uncomfortable and how deceitful people can be. Nobody has ever provided an example of what critical race theory is. It's a pretense that it is a finished piece of liberal philosophy that explains all of race relations. It's never really existed. So to me, it's another in a long line of sarcastic evasions. to substitute for genuine interaction.
You are a storyteller. You are a teller of other people's stories. You've sort of dedicated your life to that, and your history is done so beautifully because it's a narrative history. I hear you saying, in a sense, that we need to find ways by which to listen to other people's stories, the stories of their own experience of race. This is a segue to encourage you to tell us about your next writing project and how you're eliciting the stories of race over time. So tell us about that, and tell us about how are ways which we can cross that divide to hear other people's stories.
Well, the first thing I would say about that is that when you do that and you interact with people, you're not just hearing stories or telling stories, you're creating a story between you. You're creating a common story. I think I told you today that Diane Nash, the same one who said that the movement was like her wedding day and her knees shaking, she said that they had a 2-step initiation program for everybody that was taking part in the sit-ins in Nashville. It was really the shock troops of the sit-ins. Number one was that they let people discuss their fears and their misgivings. After all, many of these people are the first young black people, the first people in their whole families who have ever been to college. And they're putting the hopes and dreams of their families at risk that they're going to get kicked out. So there was a lot of trepidation. But she said the 2-part thing was to talk them through their misgivings. Do you really want to do this? But she said the key thing was that after they had their first demonstration, whether they ran, whether they were arrested, whether nothing happened, they asked everybody to come up in front of the group and tell the story of what happened and how they felt about it, and that this telling was creating a story that they all shared. And to her, this was the essence of movement. You know, a movement is something that starts out, in your conscience or something that's very private, but it grows and becomes a social movement when it's shared and you discover things that move other people in the same way. And that this discipline that they had in Nashville was to create a shared story by talking. And, we need to have more of that. Do things together that create stories and then share your reaction to those stories, and it almost guarantees some form of change or growth. It may not always be good, but it's going to be something. It's about creating a common story. And of course, that's what a country is, I was fortunate enough to take a graduate class when I was in grad school from Hannah Arendt, the philosopher. I admit she was the first female teacher. I didn't have female teachers growing up, but she was the first teacher that put me in awe just of the way she would talk. But she would say, we're sitting around a table. Every human institution is the equivalent of this table. It's something that will make people sit around and create a common story, whether it's the U.S. Congress or this church. That's what institutions are, so you're creating a common story. Now, the history I'm trying to write now, the tentative title is Freedom's Veil, Race in American History. And it's about how race, in my view, properly viewed, informs our very vocabulary and everything else in ways that are beyond our consciousness. One tiny example. If you are a history major and you research the period after the Civil War, the end of Reconstruction, in Eric Foner's book, in C. Vann Woodward's book, in Nell Painter's book, every major historian there is, the period is officially classified as redemption. Okay, it's the redeemers overthrew the political system in the South that the Republicans were trying to do of voter suppression. If you talk to a historian and you refer to that period by any other term, they don't know what you're talking about. It is part of the vocabulary. Nobody thinks, and C. Vann Woodward is one of my heroes, and so is Eric Foner. But they created a language to describe what in truth was the most widespread terrorism that ever existed on the North American continent through the people who had formerly been in the slave patrols. That's what we think of it as the Klan, but the slave patrols were all over, and they were by various names, and they had been doing the same function to suppress black slaves legally, and then they did the same thing to suppress the black vote. The question, how is it that historians, including liberal historians, universally adopted a religious term, redemption, to characterize hideous slavery in the United States? Most historians are resolutely secular. They don't use spiritual terms. But to come up with redemption for that, of all places, is part of the unconscious inheritance. I mentioned in my little talk, every kid knows that they may not know what a carpetbagger and a scalawag are, but they know it's bad. And these were people who believed that black people should be able to vote. And so from the very beginning of American history, I've been trying to trace. There are periods when race carries our realization of the promise of democracy and what votes really mean forward. The Civil War is one, the Civil Rights period, but in both cases there were backlashes afterward that not only undid some of that progress, but also changed the very way we thought about it so that we didn't even remember what happened. We don't remember the period at the end of Reconstruction as a period of terrorism, and I've tried to document what that is. I'm trying to keep a balance here to be unflinching about how cruel race relations can be when people deceive themselves into kind of tribal overconfidence, tribal cruelty. It's awful. But on the other hand, like Frederick Douglass, I'm trying to say that's true, but there's still promise in this system, even though it was invented by slaveholders. They were trying to eliminate violence among themselves, and that was a pretty noble goal because it was the only thing people knew, and they worked hard at it. I think race is like freedom's gate. It's the barometer of our political health, and it's either pushing that gate open, or sadly, sometimes it's pushing that gate closed, and it affects the very way we think about it and talk about things. So, and the hard part of this is that I still believe that it should be storytelling and not an essay, and it's covering all of American history, so it's really hard to find precisely the right stories that I think can invite a reader in to share this story and then appreciate the breadth of what it's saying about how significant race relations is going forward or going backward, and how it affects us unconsciously. We have to think about it more.
Well, we can't wait.
I can't wait either. I can tell you that.
Well, we could talk all night, and isn't he wonderful just to listen to and his story? So. Again, you have challenged us, and I encourage you to pick up the trilogy. It really is a page turner. I can't stop reading it. It's a wonderful collection.
I want to have a disclosure about that. The little book you held up, the little book, The King Ears, the little one, that is language from the trilogy. That is not new writing. It says that in the book. It says it right at the beginning. That book is the product of many, many teachers. The dedication you'll see is for teachers of history and students of freedom, or students of freedom and teachers of history. It's because history teachers across the country said, we love the narrative, and it's really hard to find stories that are personal about this period, but I can't ask my student to buy a 600-page book. So can you possibly pick out some stories that give a gist of this thing that teachers can use and assign in a short book? And that's the product of that. It introduces and gives you a taste of what's in the larger trilogy, but I don't want anybody who's read the trilogy to think they're getting something new in that. That's just a disclosure. And if you did, I'll refund your purchase.
Just again, a reminder that we would love to get your little tear-off from the information card we've given you in order for us to make you aware of ongoing events. Make sure to take that information home with you. Also on the back, if you'd like to learn more about what is happening at Church of the Palms, there's a little QR code on this little card. It's back at the welcome table. Feel free to take one of those, and we can certainly make you aware of things that are happening here at Church of the Palms. What I'm going to do after I close this in prayer is I'm going to hope that the waters remain parted down the middle aisle here, excuse the phrase, and make our way so that Mr. Branch and I can make our way to the back where he will be available to sign books and greet you as you make your way out. Also, another reminder, if you'd like to sign up for the Newtown Trolley Tour on March the 3rd, Joan Emmerich is back there, and we'll be happy to take your reservation and your money, $45 for that on March the 3rd. So let us pray. We thank you, O God, for this stimulating time of learning. We are grateful for our friend Taylor and for the work that he has committed to this project and for helping us to be in touch with our history and helping perhaps to incite in us a passion and a hope to do more such that we can bring about a further restoration of your vision for your world and for your humanity. So we pray that your Spirit will, through these moments, inspire us to be about this good work. And we pray it in Christ. Amen.
Amen.
So let us move to the back.